Welcome to Drift Off. Tonight, I'd like to invite you on a gentle journey into one of the most remarkable historical discoveries of modern times. A story not of a lost tomb in a desert, not of a buried ship beneath an ancient mound, not of a stone that unlocked a forgotten language, but of a king. A king whose final resting place was lost for more than 500 years. A king remembered in history, in legend, in argument, and in Shakespeare. And then, astonishingly found beneath a modern car park in the city of Leicester. Tonight, we are travelling into the story of Richard III, the last Plantagenet king of England, the last English king to die in battle, and the king who was found after centuries of uncertainty beneath the ordinary surface of a city. As you settle comfortably, allow your shoulders to soften. Allow the day to begin drifting gently away. There's nothing to memorize tonight. Nothing to study. Nothing you need to keep hold of. The story can simply move quietly past, like lamplight passing over an old stone wall. And if sleep arrives before we reach the end, you're welcome to follow it. You don't need to hear the ending. For now, imagine Leicester at night. A quiet city. Streetlights glowing softly. Old buildings resting beside modern roads. People passing by without knowing how much history lies beneath their feet. Because sometimes the past is not hidden in some distant landscape. Sometimes it's resting quietly beneath the places we walk every day. Richard III ruled England for only a short time. From 1483 until 1485. Just 2 years. A brief reign at the end of a long and unsettled period of English history. He belonged to the House of York, one of the rival branches in the Wars of the Roses. A series of conflicts over the English throne between the houses of York and Lancaster. By the time Richard became king, England had already lived through decades of dynastic uncertainty. Families had risen. Families had fallen. Crowns had changed hands. Allegiances had shifted. And the future of the kingdom was still not secure. Richard's reign would end on the 22nd of August, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth field in Leicestershire. There, Richard was killed in battle. His opponent, Henry Tudor, became King Henry VII. The Tudor dynasty began, and the Plantagenet dynasty came to an end. History often remembers moments like that as turning points. A crown passing from one age to another. A battlefield becoming a boundary between two eras. Medieval England beginning to give way to Tudor England. But tonight, we don't need to dwell on the battle itself. That will be for another story. Instead, we follow what happened afterwards. Because after Richard died, his body was taken to Leicester. There he was buried in the church of the Franciscan Friars, the Grey Friars, a religious house in the heart of the town. His burial was not grand, not like the burial of a victorious king, not like the royal ceremonies that might have been expected in quieter times. But it was a burial, a real place, a real grave. And for a time, people knew where Richard lay. Then the centuries began to move. The world changed. The Tudor age unfolded. The monasteries and friaries of England were dissolved under Henry VIII. Grey Friars in Leicester was closed. Its church was eventually demolished. The buildings disappeared. The land changed hands. Streets shifted. New structures appeared. Old walls were forgotten. And slowly, Richard's grave was lost. Not in a single dramatic moment. Not with a great mystery announced to the world, but gradually, quietly. As cities so often change, a wall removed, a building replaced, a boundary forgotten, a name fading from memory. At some point, the exact location of the friary church was no longer clear, and with it, the king's resting place disappeared from certainty. Over the centuries, stories grew. One rumour claimed that Richard's bones had been dug up and thrown into the River Soar. For a long time, many people accepted the idea that his remains were gone forever, washed away, lost beyond recovery. Yet not everyone was convinced. Some historians believe the story of the river was unlikely. if the grave had been inside the Grey Friars church, perhaps the remains had not been moved at all. Perhaps the king was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of a living city. By the early 21st century, the site of Grey Friars was covered by modern buildings, a former school playground, and car parks. Nothing above ground clearly announced that a medieval king might be nearby. There were no towers of the friary still standing, no visible church walls, no royal tomb, only an ordinary city. Tarmac, parking bays, everyday life. Yet interest in Richard III had never entirely disappeared. He remained one of England's most debated kings. Some saw him through the dark image shaped by Tudor history and Shakespeare's famous play. Others believed that he'd been unfairly remembered. For centuries, people argued about his character, his reign, and his legacy. But beneath all those arguments was a far simpler question. Where was he? In 2011, Philippa Langley, a member of the Richard III Society, approached University of Leicester Archaeological Services with the idea of searching for Richard's burial place. It was an ambitious idea. Some might have called it improbable. The area was modern. The friary was lost. The exact position of the church was uncertain. Even if archaeologists found the friary, finding the grave of Richard III would be far from guaranteed. Yet, archaeology often begins with questions like this. Patient questions. Where was the friary? Where was the church? Where might a king have been buried? Researchers studied maps. They examined historic records. They considered the layout of the old friary. They identified possible places to dig. And in August 2012, the excavation began. Imagine the scene. Not a remote valley, not an ancient desert, not a windswept hill, but a car park in Leicester. Painted lines on tarmac, modern buildings nearby. Archaeologists preparing to cut through the surface of the present. The dig began on the 25th of August 2012. Almost immediately, the excavation produced signs of the medieval friary. Walls, floors, fragments of a lost religious house beginning to appear beneath the modern city. Then, In the first trench, archaeologists uncovered something even more extraordinary: a human burial. The remains were found within what would later be understood as the choir area of the Grey Friars church, the exact place where Richard was believed to have been buried. At first, no one could simply declare that a king had been found. The discovery needed patience, evidence, testing, care. The remains were excavated, recorded, protected, and studied. Slowly, the clues began to gather. The skeleton was that of an adult male. The age fit Richard. The location fit Richard. The body showed signs consistent with a violent death in battle, and the spine showed a pronounced curvature. For centuries, descriptions and depictions of Richard had referred to his physical appearance in ways that were often exaggerated or distorted. The evidence showed that he had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, not the monstrous figure of legend, not the caricature created by hostile history, but a human being, a man, a king. And possibly after all those centuries, Richard himself. The investigation that followed brought together many different kinds of evidence. Osteology, the study of bones, radiocarbon dating, forensic analysis, stable isotope analysis, genealogy, DNA. Each piece mattered. No single clue stood alone. The location within Grey Friars mattered. The age and gender of the skeleton mattered. The spinal curvature, the battle injuries, the dating evidence mattered. And then came the genetic work. Scientists compared mitochondrial DNA from the remains with living female line relatives descended from Richard's family. One of those relatives was Michael Ibsen. Another was Wendy Duldig. The mitochondrial DNA evidence supported the identification. Other evidence supported it too. A historical puzzle, lost for more than 500 years, had become a modern investigation. The past and the present, meeting in a laboratory, in archive records, in the soil, beneath a car park. In February 2013, the University of Leicester announced to the world that the remains found at Grey Friars were those of King Richard III. The news travelled everywhere. A missing king had been found, not in a royal tomb, not beneath a cathedral monument, but beneath a car park in the middle of Leicester. A city had been walking above him for generations. And all the while, history had been waiting quietly underneath. The discovery mattered for many reasons. It solved one of England's most famous historical mysteries. It confirmed where Richard had been buried. It showed that the story of his remains being thrown into the River Soar was not true. It gave historians new evidence about his body, his death, and his final resting place. But it also did something more human. It changed the way that people saw him. For centuries, Richard III had existed partly as a historical figure and partly as a legend. A king shaped by enemies, by Tudor memory, by dramatic storytelling, or by Shakespeare's unforgettable villain. Yet the discovery beneath the car park made him real again. Not simply a character, not simply a reputation, but a person. A man who had lived, ruled, fought, died. A human being whose bones had rested beneath the city for more than 500 years. The discovery did not answer every question about Richard's life or reign, but it gave us something remarkable. A lost king, a lost grave, found again. After the identification, another question arose. Where should Richard be buried? Eventually, it was decided that he would be reinterred at Leicester Cathedral. This time with ceremony, with care, with public attention, with the eyes of the world once more briefly turned toward Leicester. In March 2015. His new tomb now stands in Leicester Cathedral, a simple, solemn place, a place where visitors can pause, a place where the king who had been lost beneath the city can be remembered. And now, as our journey begins to draw gently to a close, imagine Leicester at night once more. The city quiet, the streets calm, the cathedral resting beneath the dark sky. Somewhere nearby, the place where Grey Friars once stood lies still beneath the modern city. The centuries have moved on, yet the story remains. Perhaps your own thoughts are beginning to quiet now. Perhaps your breathing has become a little slower, a little deeper, a little easier. The story has already done its work. There's nothing more you need to follow tonight. Nothing more you need to understand. Nothing more you need to carry. The city can continue resting without us. The cathedral can remain beneath the stars. And you can rest now, allowing your shoulders to soften, your jaw to loosen, and the muscles around your eyes to relax. You are safe, comfortable, supported. Nothing is expected of you. Nothing is required from you. You're allowed to simply let go. Become sleepy. You don't need to hear the ending. If you'd like another sleepy history journey, there'll always be one waiting for you here. Good night, my friends.